Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. This week, what I'd like to chat about is the 25th Amendment and what people think it will actually accomplish and why they're proposing it's used. The 25th Amendment allows the Vice President and Cabinet to remove the President of the United States, citing his incapacity to fulfill the office of President. Now, some people are suggesting the 25th Amendment be invoked because of the readily apparent cognitive decline of the current president and saying he's no longer capable to fulfill the duties of his office. However, interestingly, the 25th Amendment suggestions and rumors always come about once the president has done something unpopular and arguably illegal. So it seems that there is this hope that the 25th Amendment, the removal of the current president, would somehow change politics radically. It would deal with the issues that we're facing. It would act as a kind of panacea to address all the issues they see in politics. If this president is removed from office, we can go back to normal, seeing him as the root of the current political issues in this country, which we are currently spreading abroad. However, I don't think the 25th Amendment will really address the underlying issues that have gotten the country to where it is today. And to help us better understand this current issue and how we can respond to it, we're going to see what wisdom we can draw from the founders, examples from history, and a lot of the videos that we've already done so far on this channel. So don't worry, I'll include the links to them below. From my perspective, the 25th Amendment and the removal of this president in that manner would not address the movement and ideology that brought him to power. This hierarchical and oligarchic ideology that he rode the wave of into office. Now, one way to understand US history is the tension between hierarchical and oligarchic ideologies, like the one embodied in the current administration, and pushes towards more equality, more liberty, more justice for more people, as I put forward in the first video. This tension was present at the Constitutional Convention, and we can even see in the Declaration of Independence that tension between theory and practice that we discussed in an earlier video. The Declaration of Independence declares all men are created equal, and some of the founders took that to heart. William Whipple signs the Declaration of Independence and frees his slaves, recognizing the hypocrisy of signing the Declaration and keeping his slaves. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, does not. He doesn't even free his own children at the end of his life. And I use the institution of slavery because it embodies a hierarchical and oligarchic ideology. We have owners and slaves, lords and serfs. This is inherently hierarchical and oligarchic. Later in their life, many of the founders began to realize, even if they didn't in signing the Declaration of Independence or helping ratify the US Constitution, that the hierarchical, oppressive, and dehumanizing institution of slavery was antithetical to the founding ideals of the United States on a philosophical and ideological level. And that to ignore this would destroy the Union, would destroy the United States. Washington realizes this and responds by freeing his slaves at the end of his life, hoping that others would follow suit and that the problem would solve itself through the moral virtue of these slave owners. Benjamin Franklin goes a step further. He also frees his slaves far earlier in life and becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And the last public act that he's involved in is petitioning the US Congress to find ways to begin to abolish slavery because he sees this danger coming down the road for the United States. On a theoretical level, James Wilson rejects the idea of a natural superior outright. He says that this is against the law of nature. If there were people who were superior and meant to rule over others, that God would make it clear in their nature, whether it's wisdom or strength or whatever else. He makes joke after joke about how absurd and ridiculous this hierarchical ideology is. And as a Supreme Court justice, he argues that carving out caveats in the law for any natural person or artificial person, i.e., a government or corporation, or potentially even institution, would be antithetical to the United States. In his terms, it would be repugnant to our very existence as a nation. So we can see on a theoretical level, the founders agreed not only that America is about equality, liberty, and justice for all, but that they hadn't fully realized it, and that allowing hierarchical and oligarchic ideologies to continue to flourish in the culture and society of the United States would potentially threaten the very existence of the United States. However, they did not address these social and cultural issues, this ideology outright. They kicked the can down the road, hoping that this problem would just magically solve itself, that it would fizzle out and become economically unviable. They were wrong. It only grew and spread and became more ingrained until it came to a head in the Civil War, and this tension between equality and hierarchy exploded in war. And we know that it was over this issue that the war was fought because the Confederacy made this clear. Alexander Stephens, in his cornerstone speech, argues that the problem with the U.S. Constitution is that it's based on this idea of equality, and particularly equality between the races. He argues the Confederacy has solved this problem by recognizing the cornerstone or great truth on which their Constitution is founded, and that's that the races are not equal, and that the other races should be subordinate to the superior race. The Civil War is about this tension and debate between equality and hierarchy, this continuing back and forth between those trying to realize more equality, more liberty, more justice for more people, and the reactionary pushback by people trying to protect or reestablish hierarchical institutions and hierarchical and oligarchic ideologies. Now, the North or Union wins the war, and we have the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction Amendments that, among other things, give the formerly enslaved people, or at least the men, the right to vote. However, some scholars, who I would agree with, argue that the South won the peace, that this ideology remained in culture and society and continued to propagate itself and grow and expand and change. Now, we can see this reaction most clearly in things like the Jim Crow South, reactions to the civil rights movement, reactions to President Obama being elected, reactions to Black Lives Matter. And if you really want to map out this reaction, all you have to do is look at when Confederate statues are put up. And at the beginning of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois made this point clear about the Civil War. He said, simply giving formerly enslaved people the right to vote did not include them in the body politic. It did not bring them into the community, into society. It didn't make them Americans. Instead, he argues, the 14th Amendment that gave them the right to vote simply ended the war and began a race feud. That this fledgling group of people had been sacrificed on the altar of national integrity for the sake of a kind of unity and reconciliation that let us move along. The ideology was not addressed. The culture was not addressed. And we can see that reconciliation without truth and accountability isn't really reconciliation at all, and doesn't provide the foundation that would allow us to move forward as a unified people. So where do we see this hierarchical and oligarchic ideology today, particularly in the current administration and current political movements? Now, on a logical, philosophical level, a hierarchy or Oligarchy differentiates between groups of people based on certain things, which is inherently authoritarian. Those things normally include things like race, gender, wealth, and religion, and normally some combination of all of them. Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, Wilson and the founders recognize that any hierarchy, especially when it concerns a differentiation in how the law is applied, is antithetical to the United States and the very idea of democracy and liberty. However, today we can see multiple different iterations of this oligarchic ideologies in the current administration. For instance, we still see this racial differentiation, as I noted in the slavery example, but currently we see it in ethno-nationalists or what we might call classic or traditional fascists. White people are at the top and everybody else is below. Now, the people that represent this in the current administration are people like Stephen Miller with his anti-immigration rhetoric. They want a white America. Now, when it comes to wealth, we can also see this as we discussed in an earlier video about the natural aristocracy, where the people think that people are wealthy for a reason and therefore they should rule us. This takes another step where wealthy people start believing that they have a right to rule over this. Currently, this has names like techno-fascism and is epitomized in the Silicon Valley elites who are buying up essentially what political scientists would call the public sphere, media outlets, etc. Now, this is exemplified in people like Elon Musk, who ran Doge and was kind of the shadow president for the first few months, thought he was just allowed to govern however he wanted. And we also see this hierarchy based on religion, as we discussed in last week's video about Christian nationalism. Christianity is at the top, and all other religions are below, and not only below, but the evil enemies of God. Little dehumanizing. Now, as we discussed, this is epitomized in somebody like Pete Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense. Now, hierarchy in terms of gender runs through all of these iterations of these hierarchical and oligarchic ideologies, these different kinds of fascism. And we can see this in calls for repealing the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, this idea of getting women back into the home and out of the workplace, removing their rights to an abortion, the right to bodily autonomy, and things like that. And that's one point that all of these different ideologies and the people who represent them seem to agree upon. So with that, let's turn back to the 25th Amendment. Would removing the current president through that mechanism actually address these cultural, social, and ideological issues and the damage done to democracy? I would say no. The current president and his administration are a symptom, not a cause. The current president rode the wave of this reactionary force that reinvigorated the different iterations of this hierarchical and oligarchic ideology. He didn't cause them. He didn't bring them about. And so removing him would not do much to deal with him. Moreover, as I listed in his administration, this ideology is alive and well. And essentially what we would get to watch is which of these forms of fascism would come out on top in the struggle in the ensuing power vacuum. It's not necessarily a show I'd like to watch. However, it would potentially stop the current war and remove a man who appears to be suffering rapid cognitive decline from having access to nuclear weapons. And those are not small things. So I'm not saying this shouldn't be done. What I am saying is we need to stay focused on the deeper issues and problems that we need to fix to create an America and an Americanness that we can all live in and be proud of again, so that we can reconcile within our own country and reconcile with the world and our now former allies and friends. How I think this can be accomplished is through truth, accountability, reconciliation, and reconceptualization. Now, we have examples in history of truth and accountability leading to reconciliation and a new way forward. For instance, After World War II, we had the Nuremberg trials. We sought the truth and held people accountable to it. And in this process, the United States helped create international law in terms of defining crimes against humanity and war crimes. Similarly, the French held the Nazi collaborators, the Vichy government, to account in their own trials. The US helped other countries begin denazification programs to educate the citizens and help them leave this ideology that started a world war and killed millions of people, not only in combat, but through industrial extermination, the Holocaust. Now, we also see truth and accountability in the example of President Nelson Mandela, his Truth and Reconciliation, as a means of ending apartheid and bringing the country back together on an equal footing. Now, what truth and accountability does is it recognizes the harm done and holds the people who committed that crime accountable for it. What this does is it gives us a firm foundation on which we can build a new community with a shared epistemological framework and worldview. But what it also does is it reinforces that we are all equal under the law, something that the founders saw as an essential part of what it means to be American, but also just liberty. Democracy demands that we are all equally subject to the law. And by holding elites and our leaders accountable, what it does is it forces our government and our representatives to follow our will instead of their interest, which is John Dewey's definition of what a truly representational government actually is. This is how we restore democracy and begin to find reconciliation within the country and with the Society of Nations, the international community, that we've done a lot of harm to in this past year and a half. And furthermore, we need to reconceptualize and reimagine what America can and should be, because this radicalization and resurgence of this authoritarian ideology didn't come out of nowhere. There were social, cultural, economic, and political issues that drove people in this direction, as well as the tribal epistemologies that we've discussed in previous videos that made it difficult for them to see the trap that they were falling into. This is going to take a lot of work and a lot of reform, and is not as simple as removing one problematic figure. So the question is, will we take up the mantle our founders left us of fixing and improving the foundation that they left us? Will we learn from their mistake and not kick the can down the road and let this authoritarian ideology retreat, regroup, just to raise its ugly head again in another few decades? Will we deal with the social, cultural, ideological, and structural issues that allow this ideology to continue to not only survive, but at times thrive and repress large swaths of the United States and bring us all backwards and threaten real harm to not only groups of people within the United States, but other countries as well? I think we try to deal with this problematic ideology once and for all, that we take up the duty and responsibility that our founders and intervening generations left us to fix, improve, and reimagine our country to realize a better future for all of us. And I think part of how we begin to do this is to understand U.S. history as a back and forth, a tension between equality and hierarchy in society, culture, and ideology. And then in doing so, we get to decide who is the protagonist, the hero, and the antagonist. Is it the people like William Whipple and Washington at the end of his life, or is it Jefferson, who is unwilling to deal with the shame of his own hypocrisy? Who do we lift up and look to as our heroes of embodying the American spirit, and why? And I think that will help us reconceptualize the United States, improve it, and move forward in a far better direction. However, as always, it's not up to me to decide. It's up to us. That's still what we, the people, means. And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that decision. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting and educational. If you're interested in more content like this, you can look through my Substack and YouTube channel for more videos. You can also subscribe so you don't miss the new ones when they come out every Friday. And if you'd like a little bit more detail, I write an essay for each week's chat that goes into a little bit more detail and is a little bit more structured. So with that, I'll say thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.